So we start off the discussion with of Module 1 with economic development efforts in Africa. The dynamics of getting Africa to developed started sometimes around the period that most African economies actually got independent from the colonial powers. And I've tried to divide this into what I called three distinct and broad phases of economic development perspective or efforts. And the first phase of economic development effort began in 1960s and ended sometimes in the late 1970s. And this was the period that I call the import substitution industrialization phase. At this particular point in time, most African economies actually try to adopt this type of policy in order to substitute the production of import goods that they actually been taking, they have actually been importing from from the colonial powers and start the production within the African component. And I said that this particular strategy seems to have handed down to the African countries by the advanced capitalist economies through the Bretton Woods institutions as a way of enhancing economic performance of the continent with little or no input by African countries. So, as much as possible, it's the import substitution industrialization phase began after the political independence, and it started with domestic production of consumer goods that were previously imported. That was the idea, that the domestic market for this good already existed and could form the basis for initiating an industrialization program. So the initial focus was on consumer goods. There was the expectation that as the industrialization process proceeds, there will also be domestic production of intermediate and capital goods needed by domestic consumer goods industry. But along the line, domestic infant industries were identified and nurtured through trade protection and other domestic policies. So some of the other elements of the import substitution industrialization, extensive tariff and non-tariff barriers, currency overvaluation, as well as subsidized interest rates. So, however, it did not last for long before the ISI actually face some challenges because the agricultural sector was neglected. It did not lay emphasis on the generation of foreign exchange. The focus of import substitution industrialization was more on setting up factories rather than building the entrepreneurial capabilities that will foster industrial dynamism and the development of competitive export sector. So, in the late 1970s, the scarcity of foreign exchange became a serious constraint on industrial development in the region. So the ISI, the import substitution industrialization, eventually ran into certain difficulties. Then thereafter, the structural adjustment phase, the structural adjustment program phase, which represent that began in the early 1980s and ended in the late 1990s, came into effect. And at this particular point in time, if you take a look at it, the origin of SAP could be traced back to the early 1980s, when African countries experienced severe balance of payment crisis resulting from the cumulative effects of the oil crisis. So, in response to that, many countries sought financial assistance from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And the IMF and the World Bank interpretation of the crisis and African industrial development problem was that it had to do with poor domestic policies. And so the recommendation was African countries should adopt the structural adjustment program, SAPs. And the report was of the view that Africa's competitive advantage lay in agriculture and not in industry. So African countries that adopted SAPs were expected to implement certain policy reforms. And some of the policy reforms included the deregulation of interest rates, trade liberalization, currency devaluation, withdrawal out of government subsidy, privatization of state-owned enterprises. And the objective of SAP was actually to reduce the role of the state in the industrialization and development process and give market forces more room in the allocation of resources. And if you take a critical look at SAP, what it did at that particular point was to place Africa on a low growth path, undermine economic diversification efforts, and also led to an erosion of the industrial base in the region. So, for example, in Ghana, Nigeria, Zambia, and some other African countries, the challenges of trade liberalization actually exposed some domestic firms to import competition and led to a closure of most manufacturing firms in Africa. So SAP did not lead to the attainment of objective of structural transformation and export diversification in Africa. So it did not make Africa competitive. It did not trigger industrial development, and also did not lay the foundation for sustained economic growth in the continent. So as a result of that, that now led to the third phase of what I call the poverty reduction strategy papers phase that began in year 2000. And at this particular point in time, many African countries have accumulated enormous foreign debt, and the burden of debt became an obstacle to growth and economic development in the continent. So in 1996, in response to the challenge, the heavily indebted poor countries was actually launched. And thereafter, there was a slow progress to the challenge or to the program of heavily indebted poor country initiative, and that led to the adoption of what I call the enhanced heavily indebted poor countries initiative, which are called EHIPC. So why the PRSP, that is the Poverty Reduction Strategy Papers, differs from the import substitution industrialization and the structural adjustment program, in the sense that it was specifically designed as a debt relief program. It is evident that it did have consequences for industrial development in Africa, because the fourth generation of the PRSPs led to a shift of resources from the production to the social sectors. And the second generation PRSPs have tried to address social sector bias problem associated with the fourth generation PRSP, but it did actually not come out. Interest in the productive sector in the second generation PRSP in Africa tends to be in agriculture and its related industries, reflecting largely the widespread view that African countries have a comparative advantage in these industries and that agriculture is an important source of growth. In essence, most of this set of initiatives did not take the comparative advantage of Africa into consideration when they were being designed. And that explains some of the challenges or some of the failures of some of these economic development efforts that Africa has made in order to move the continent forward. So all in all, perhaps if this set of efforts, these policy measures, or these programs formulation have taken into the consideration that Africa has a comparative advantage in agriculture, which can then be pushed further into allied manufacturing, perhaps things would actually have been much more better and interesting. So, and that takes us to the next slide, which is structural break in the process of economic development in Africa. Africa and countries enjoy relatively high growth since the beginning of the decade, and a lot of things have been actually attributed to the growth. Some of them include the end of armed conflicts. Before, African countries engaged each other so much in civil wars. Coup d'etat was coming almost every now and then. It is no longer popular now. there have been some form of improved macroeconomic management. External debts have gone down in some countries. Then some African countries have also undertaken what I call structural and institutional reforms to create a better and more conducive business climate. However, while the growth performance has been quite significant, there is concern over the non-inclusive nature of the growth that have been recorded in Africa. And this has resulted in the paradox of growth with deepened poverty, rising unemployment, as well as a worsening inequality. You then look at the paradox. African countries is growing, is doing very well. Some countries even recorded double-digit growth. But the challenge comes to the fact that these growths have come with the cost of increased poverty level. They have come with rising unemployment as well as a worsening inequality. So in the context of development financing, decent economic growth is a necessary condition for mobilizing resources from various sources. So at the point that African countries were adopting the import substitution industrialization, that they adopted the structural adjustment program, that they adopted the poverty reduction strategy programs, there were breaks, significant breaks in the growth trajectory, such that the growth did not bring about an inclusive framework in which that can actually reduce poverty, that can actually reduce unemployment, and that can also reduce inequality in the continent. So that is why we need the decent growth that can actually give an opportunity of mobilizing adequate domestic resources from different sources. So a growing economy that is not witnessing structural transformation, that in terms of economic diversification, is an incapable economy from the point of view of resource mobilization for the purpose of financing inclusive development. Because we want an Africa that is actually leaving no one behind, that is taking the responsibility. So while many African countries have registered high growth rates, they have actually come across certain set of challenges that shows that they're actually not capable enough of sustaining the growth that can actually make domestic resource mobilization necessary to close the resource gap that you're actually facing in Africa. Perhaps in order to do that, African countries need to invest in infrastructure for us to have an inclusive growth. You need to invest in infrastructure, invest in human resources, as well as a technological development that can actually make private investment to thrive, and then can actually scale up growth that can also diversify the economic base and also create decent jobs for the youthful population that we actually have in Africa. Because most African economies have always been relying on natural resources. For example, in Nigeria, they rely so much on crude oil. In some other countries, they rely on some solid minerals such as diamond and gold, and that actually bring a lot of challenges in the continent. So that takes us to the philosophical underpinnings on the necessity for domestic resource mobilization. African country, if you are trying to look at where Africa has been coming from, the colonial governments that were giving independence to African economies actually imposed the import substitution industrialization strategy to them. The structural adjustment program was imposed by the World Bank and the IMF. And the same agency also more or less play a big role in the poverty reduction strategy. That shows that Africa did not own its own development agenda. So for us to be able to mobilize resources that can transform our investment environment, that can bring about economic transformation, there is a need for African economies to own the development agenda. The African country ownership of the post-2015 development agenda is essential to undermine the intellectual roots of poverty. African leaders should involve communities in the planning, in the implementation, in the monitoring and assessment of the development agenda. So let it be a development agenda that is formulated by Africans for Africa. Economic independence and sustainable development. If Africa truly wants to break away from colonial economic system and ensure, it needs to ensure that social institutions are in place. That is, property rights are taken into consideration, agricultural incentive to make the state self-sufficient in food production, and development of resource-based manufacturing in order to move the percentage of gross domestic products in the direction of manufacturing and away from subsistence farming. Africa also needs to take another look on how agriculture is actually managed. Agriculture now is not a business. It's a big business across the world. The value chain must be well encouraged and be well situated in the context of agriculture, the economic development of African economies. So, what is the rationale for domestic resource mobilization in Africa? Domestic resource mobilization can be defined as the generation of savings from domestic resources and their allocation to socially productive investment. Mark that word, to socially productive investment. You are not mobilizing resources just for the fun of it. You are mobilizing it to be able to move it to socially productive investment that can generate additional resources, that can generate sustainable growth, that can generate decent jobs into the society. And domestic resource mobilization process in this framework involves, so the rationale for domestic resource mobilization and what is DRM. Domestic resource mobilization can be defined as the generation of savings from domestic resources and their allocation to socially productive investments. It involves measures to support fiscal consolidation, improve revenue management, strengthen public expenditure strengthen public expenditure management, enhance generation of domestic savings, and increase private resource mobilization for investment opportunities, especially for micro, small, and medium enterprises. The opportunity that this offers is far that if you take all this together, then you have what we call holistic framework for domestic resource mobilization. You are not mobilizing resources just for the fun of it. You are mobilizing to be able to allocate it to socially productive investment that also continue to generate more resources, that continue to reduce poverty, reducing inequality, and also generate decent jobs. And why do we really need domestic resource mobilization? And I said, the challenges of domestic resource mobilization in Africa is enormous. Africa has been growing, but the savings rate has been hovering around 12%, while investment rate has been increasingly slow and also be lower. So that means there's a widening gap between investment and savings in the continent. The usual providers of assistance have their own serious preoccupations with COVID-19. Sometimes from February, we had the challenges of COVID-19 that resulted in the pandemic. And that has actually brought out the challenges from the foreign aid donors in terms of giving resources to Africa, because their own economies have also been decimated. And this is a big challenge for Africa. And if you are having such a big challenge for Africa, it is not going to be business as usual for us to be able to get aids from our foreign donors. So they've been having challenges of debt, hospitalization, and unemployment, people being thrown out of jobs. So that means opportunities of getting foreign aids is going to be lower. And the present development budget in Africa is also inadequate. However, the continent has a resource base to increase development finance. So it is then imperative for Africa to intensify its domestic resource mobilization efforts in order to reduce dependence on external sources of finance, which is foreign aid, we need to secure the policy space, and also we need to also control our development agenda. That we have an agenda that is done, that is being developed by Africa for Africa, because that also takes into consideration the structural characteristics of the African continent. That is actually one of the base fundamental reasons that we need domestic resource mobilization, that we don't need to rely on foreign aid. And then, what are the benefits that domestic resource mobilization is going to confer on us? The DRM reduce African dependence on external capital inflows, such as official development assistance and foreign borrowing. Domestic resources allow African countries more policy space and therefore more control of their development process. And higher levels of domestic resource mobilization also facilitates higher levels of investment and economic growth and more rapid poverty reduction. More reliance on domestic resources, particularly public revenue, can lead to a better system on governance. Africa will be able to govern perfectly well. Africa will not be under the challenges of specific reforms from the Bretton Woods institution. And domestic resources are considerably more stable than external capital inflows, because you know the amount you are likely going to generate, you know your potentials towards these domestic resources. The summary is that African countries will be more able to pursue truly nationally owned development strategies that respond to their genuine priorities if they can actually follow this particular framework. We won't be developing depending on some of these fundamental development partners that actually not forthcoming. We will have been able to now develop our own development strategies and with genuine priorities listed out as our own development agenda. So, aid dependency and dwindling official development assistance. We can actually group resources, external resources, under 4 headings if you use the Monterey Consensus on Financing for Development. The first one is foreign direct investment and other forms of private foreign investment. The second one is export earnings from international trade. The third one is foreign aid and technical cooperation. And the fourth one is the process of debts forgiven by international creditors. These are basically the external sources using the Monterey Consensus on the financing for development. And over the past 60 years, over external sources of finance can be grouped under 4 headings using Monterey Consensus on financing for development, foreign direct investment, and other forms of private foreign investment, export earnings from international trade, foreign aid and technical cooperation, as well as the process of debts forgiven by international creditors. Over the past 60 years, at least 1 trillion of foreign aid is said to have been transferred to Africa, but real per capita income today is lower than it was in the 1970s. And no matter how much aid a country receives, development cannot be attained by external assistance alone. Development is essentially an internally driven process. It's essentially an internally driven process of a nation, and it's not one which can be injected exogenously by outsiders. So therefore, it is necessary and imperative for dependency and dwindling official development assistance. External sources can be grouped under 4 headings using Monterey Consensus on Financing for Development, foreign direct investment, and other forms of private foreign investment, export earnings from international trade, foreign aid and technical cooperation, the process of debt forgiven by international creditors. Over the past 60 years, at least $1 trillion of foreign aid is said to have been transferred to Africa, But real per capita income today is lower than it was in the 1970s. No matter how much aid a country receives, development cannot be attained by external assistance alone. Development is essentially an internet-driven process of a nation and is not one which can be injected exogenously by outsiders. Consequently, it is imperative that Africa mobilizes its domestic resources to drive its development process. Africa must take the lead in its development process. So, if you then take a look, DRM and emerging development agenda. The impetus for post-2015 development agenda, which is also known as SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. The SDG provides a sharp blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet now and into the future. The 17 SDG interconnect goals, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals interconnect, and in order to leave no one behind, it is important that we achieve each goal and target by the year 2030. The policy goal 1 is to end poverty in all its forms, everywhere. Policy goal 2 is end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. Policy goal 3 is to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Policy goal 4 is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities. Mobilization and emerging development agenda. Impetus for post-2015 development agenda SDGs. The SDGs provides a sharp blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet now and into the future. The 17 SDGs interconnect. In order to leave no one behind, it is important that we achieve each goal and target by 2030. Policy goal 1 is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Policy goal 2 is to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. Policy goal 3 is to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Policy goal 4 is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Policy goal 5 is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. Policy goal 6 is to ensure availability and sustainability management of water and sanitation for all. Policy goal 7 is to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Policy goal 8 is to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. Policy goal 9 is to build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. Policy goal 10 is to reduce inequality within and among countries. Policy goal 11 is to make cities and urban settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Policy goal 12 is to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Policy goal 13 is to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. Policy goal 14 is to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Policy goal 15 is to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and reverse land degradation and out biodiversity loss. Policy goal 16 is to promote peaceful and inclusive society for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Policy goal 17 is to strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development.